The sterile hum of the fluorescent lights in my office, a sound I had come to associate with purpose and precision, felt like a constant, quiet hum in my very bones. At 48, I, Sylvie Kincaid, had built a career on meticulous attention to detail, on seeing the unseen patterns, and on a quiet, unyielding patience that served me well in the often chaotic world of corporate intelligence in Boston, Massachusetts. My office, on the 17th floor of the formidable gray edifice that housed Sterling and Finch, was more than just a room with a view of the city's historic rooftops and the glittering harbor. It was a sanctuary of competence. I thrived in the predictable rhythm of my days, the challenge of complex problem-solving, and the camaraderie of a team I had helped cultivate into one of the most efficient in the company. For decades, I had been the steady hand, the silent engine, the one who saw the iceberg long before it threatened the ship. My routine was a comfort. Coffee brewed precisely, morning reports reviewed with a fine-tooth comb, and then the quiet hum of productivity. I was good at what I did, and I knew it. The whispers of promotions, the gentle nudges towards higher leadership had always been there, but I preferred the deep dive, the analytical rigor, the satisfaction of solving a truly intractable puzzle. I wasn't driven by ego, I was driven by excellence. My motivation was simple: to do my job and to do it well for the good of the organization and the people within it. This quiet dedication defined me, a seasoned professional who found profound satisfaction in her craft. My work was my identity, a testament to years of careful cultivation, experience, and the kind of sharp intuition that only comes with age and unwavering focus. The office felt like an extension of my home, a place of belonging. Then came Miles Thorne. He arrived with the force of a wrecking ball, a self-proclaimed prodigy fresh from a fast-track program, plucked from a lesser division and dropped into our senior, high-performing section like a golden goose. He was barely 30, with a self-assured smirk and eyes that seemed to constantly scan the room, not for insight, but for weakness. He carried himself with an air of unearned authority, often using corporate jargon he clearly didn't understand to mask a profound lack of practical experience. The youngest executive in Sterling and Finch history, he declared loudly at his introductory meeting, his voice booming with a confidence that grated on nerves. We, the seasoned professionals, the quiet architects of Sterling and Finch's operational backbone, exchanged uneasy glances. Our collective experience, spanning decades and countless successful projects, seemed to shrivel in the blast radius of his unchecked ambition. It was unsettling, like watching a child given the keys to a complex, finely tuned machine. A premonition, cold and clear, settled in my gut. Something vital was about to break. My carefully constructed world, so predictable and stable, began to tilt on an imperceptible axis. Miles's approach was my way or the highway from the very first day. He wasn't interested in understanding our systems, our methodologies, or the decades of institutional knowledge that underpinned our success. He wanted to dismantle, to rebuild, to leave his mark. And he wanted to do it fast. His immediate target, almost predictably, was Eleanor Vance. Eleanor was not just a colleague, she was a friend, a kindred spirit in the often solitary pursuit of professional excellence. By every measurable metric, she was the highest performer in our section, her output often dwarfing the combined efforts of several others. She was smart, outspoken, and unapologetically direct, qualities that Miles Thorne, with his fragile ego, perceived as threats. He once sneered, just loud enough for a few of us to overhear, that Eleanor needed to be put in her place. Another time, he muttered about her being too outspoken, as if competence and directness were cardinal sins. This wasn't leadership, it was a thinly veiled campaign of intimidation. The situation escalated quickly. Miles began making dramatic, sweeping decisions, often undermining long-established, successful protocols. He was a bull in a china shop, breaking things simply because he could, or because he thought it made him look decisive. The section, once a well-oiled machine, began to sputter. Then came the falsified documents. It was a minor internal report, but critical for regulatory compliance, and Miles had manipulated the figures to make his nascent performance look better than it was. Eleanor, ever the ethical compass, confronted him gently in a team meeting. Her voice was calm, her words carefully chosen. "Miles," she'd said, her gaze steady, "I believe there might be an inconsistency here. Falsifying this data is unethical, and it could put the company at risk. We should correct it immediately." The air in the room thickened. Miles's face, usually set in that arrogant smirk, contorted into a mask of pure fury. That single, calm statement, delivered with the quiet dignity of a true professional, was the spark. For Aliner, it became open season. For me, it was the chilling realization that this man wasn't just incompetent, he was dangerous. My role as the unseen catalyst began that day, not with a grand plan, but with a quiet, persistent hum of observation. I started watching, truly watching, Miles Thorne. Every sneer, every arbitrary decision, every veiled threat was catalogued in the quiet recesses of my mind. The promise of justice, however distant, began to form, a fragile seed in fertile ground. Miles's campaign against Aliner was systematic and cruel. He arbitrarily downgraded her performance reviews, despite irrefutable data proving her excellence. He randomly shifted her schedule and workload, assigning her impossible deadlines and then reprimanding her when she couldn't meet them, clearly designed to damage her work product and reputation. He tried to isolate her, discouraging others from collaborating with her, planting seeds of doubt about her competence. Public screaming matches became the norm, Miles's voice echoing through the office, berating Aliner for perceived slights, for minor errors he himself had created. It was humiliating, a grotesque display of power for power's sake. The entire section watched, heads bowed, fear palpable. It felt like a corporate version of spousal abuse, designed to break her spirit. Aliner, once so vibrant and confident, became hypervigilant, her eyes constantly scanning for the next attack. Miles would scream that he didn't want her on the section, yet he'd refuse every one of her attempts to transfer. It was an if I can't have you, nobody will mentality, a perverse obsession that earned him the moniker Captain Ahab among us. Our section became the Pequod, a ship doomed by its captain's single-minded madness. When we saw him, a quiet, almost imperceptible whisper would pass through the cubicles. From hell's heart I stab at thee. It was a dark, private joke, a desperate attempt to reclaim a shred of dignity in the face of such profound injustice. Morale plummeted. The section, once a beacon of efficiency, was in free fall. People went home early, some openly played board games or watched television at their desks, a stark contrast to the relentless pressure Aliner faced. Miles, like Ahab, was willing to sink his own ship and drown his crew to get his whale Aliner. And I watched. My patience, a trait I'd always valued, was stretched taut. My unyielding nature, typically reserved for complex analytical problems, began to fixate on this burgeoning injustice. I couldn't simply stand by. Wrong was wrong. I started to document everything. Not just what I saw, but what I heard, what others whispered. Dates, times, specific instances of abuse, falsified documents, arbitrary decisions. Aliner, bless her meticulous soul, was doing the same. She had stacks of notes, emails, and performance reports that contradicted Miles's manufactured narrative. I knew this couldn't continue. I took my evidence, a carefully constructed dossier of dates, times, and witnessed events, and approached our human resources department. It was a formal complaint, detailed and dispassionate, laying out the pattern of abuse and the ethical breaches. I also notified the Equal Employment Opportunity Office, just to ensure there was an official record. Then, summoning every ounce of my professional courage, I met with Miles's direct superior, a man named Mr. Henderson who had always seemed distant, almost detached from the day-to-day operations. I laid out the whole mess, from the falsified documentation to the constant public humiliation Aliner endured. I spoke calmly, professionally, letting the facts speak for themselves. Henderson listened, his face impassive, occasionally nodding. He promised to look into it. A few days later, Aliner met with Henderson, armed with her own meticulously kept notes. She emerged from that meeting with a flicker of hope in her eyes. Within the week, Aliner was transferred to a different section, a lateral move that salvaged her career, though her spirit was undeniably bruised. It was a small victory, a temporary reprieve. But I knew it wouldn't be over. Miles Thorne wasn't one to forget. And he wasn't one to forgive. My internal alarm bells screamed louder than ever. I had intervened, I had been seen. And Miles Thorne did not tolerate dissent. True to form, he came after me. It started subtly, project assignments that bordered on the impossible, deadlines shifted without notice, a sudden barrage of nitpicking emails, a chilling silence when I walked into a room. Then came the public confrontations, the same kind of belittling remarks he had used against Aliner. My own performance reviews, stellar for years, suddenly began to reflect areas for improvement that were vague, subjective, and utterly without merit. I saw the playbook. I knew what was happening. This was Miles's retribution. This was his way of ensuring no one else dared to challenge him, but I wasn't Aliner. I was Sylvie Kincaid. I had seen this coming. I had anticipated it. I had learned from watching Aliner's ordeal, from seeing the toll it took on her, how close she came to breaking. I had kept my own meticulous records. Every email, every changed deadline, every verbal accusation, every fabricated flaw in my performance review was documented. I sent my own dossier, even more comprehensive than the first, back upstairs, directly to Mr. Henderson and to HR. I didn't just complain, I presented an irrefutable case of retaliation. The evidence was overwhelming and it was irrefutable. The outcome was swift, almost anticlimactic. I wasn't fired, not publicly at least. Instead, I was offered an early retirement package. It wasn't framed as a dismissal, but as a restructuring initiative, a streamlining process designed to reduce senior personnel and create a leaner, more agile team. The implication was clear: I was too experienced, too embedded in the old ways, a relic to be gently but firmly removed. They painted it with corporate euphemisms, but the message was unmistakable. Miles Thorne had won. He hadn't destroyed me professionally, not in the way he tried to destroy a leaner, but he had sidelined me. He had taken my career, my purpose, my daily hum of productivity, and he had simply eliminated it. My colleagues looked away, offering platitudes, their fear of Miles palpable. I was 48. Too young to truly retire, too old perhaps to easily restart in such a specialized field. My identity, so intrinsically tied to my work, felt suddenly hollow. The injustice of it burned, a slow, simmering fire in my gut. I had given Sterling and Finch decades of my life, my intellect, my unyielding dedication. And in return, when I stood for what was right, I was cast aside, a casualty of one man's unchecked ego and ambition. As I packed my office, the humming fluorescent lights seemed to mock me. Each box I filled was a piece of my professional life being meticulously dismantled. My diplomas, my awards, the small, framed photos of successful projects, all were carefully wrapped and placed into cardboard boxes. The view of Boston, usually a source of quiet inspiration, now felt distant, indifferent. The city moved on, oblivious to the quiet devastation unfolding within its towers. I felt a profound sense of loss, a grief that was both personal and professional. My carefully constructed world had not just tilted, it had shattered. The promise of the beginning of my revenge journey was clear. Miles Thorne had taken my career, he had stolen my peace. And I, Sylvie Kincaid, patient, resourceful, and unyielding, would not forget. The question for the audience hung in the air: what would a woman like Sylvie, a woman stripped of her life's purpose, do with the raw, potent fuel of betrayal and years of quiet, meticulous observation? The answer, I knew, would be forged in the silence of my forced retirement. If you find stories of quiet, simmering vengeance compelling, stories where justice is finally served after years of waiting, then you should consider this. Subscribe to Tales of Revenge channel for new revenge stories daily. My story was just beginning. My first few weeks of early retirement were a desolate landscape of unfamiliar silence. The absence of the morning commute, the immediate lack of purpose when I woke, left a gaping void. My apartment in Boston, once a refuge I returned to after a stimulating day, now felt like a cage. The sounds of the city, usually a vibrant symphony, seemed muted, distant. I found myself wandering aimlessly, from the living room with its carefully curated bookshelves to the kitchen, where the coffee machine stood silent, no longer needed for a precise morning ritual. My body, accustomed to the subtle tension of office politics and demanding deadlines, felt strangely slack, untethered. Initial shock of being sidelined, of having my career meticulously dismantled by Miles Thorne, slowly gave way to a deeper, colder emotion: outrage. It wasn't a hot, volatile anger that would burn itself out. No, this was a slow, controlled burn, fueled by an unyielding sense of injustice. I would replay moments in my mind. Miles's condescending smirk, the way he dismissed years of my experience with a flick of his wrist, the carefully constructed corporate language that masked his petty cruelty. I had spent decades contributing, building, upholding the integrity of Sterling and Finch, only to be cast aside for speaking truth to power. It was an insult to my very being, a personal affront that gnawed at me. My identity, so intrinsically linked to my role, felt erased. Who was Sylvie Kincaid without her work? This was my rock bottom, a profound emotional devastation where the very fabric of my self-worth seemed to unravel. But Sylvie Kincaid was patient. And she was unyielding. This wasn't the end, it was a forced pause, a strategic retreat. Miles Thorne thought he had won, that he had neatly swept me under the rug. He had no idea what he had unleashed. The desire for retribution wasn't a fleeting thought. It was a steady, constant thrum beneath the surface of my consciousness. It became my new purpose. My motivation had refined itself, not just to see him demoted, but to ensure his total professional obliteration. He had taken everything from me. I would take everything from him. My life shifted. The quiet observation that had begun in the office intensified, becoming a pervasive, almost unconscious habit. I started to view the world, and specifically Miles Thorne's professional world, through a different lens. I was no longer an insider but an unseen catalyst, a ghost in the corporate machine. My resourcefulness, usually applied to complex business problems, was now singularly focused on one objective: gathering intel on Miles. Years, I told myself, it would take years. But I had time, all the time in the world. My first step was to maintain my network subtly. I wasn't calling old colleagues asking for gossip, not directly. Instead, I'd schedule catch-up lunches or coffees with people I genuinely liked and respected, people who were still inside Sterling and Finch. I'd listen more than I spoke, offering casual observations about how things might have changed since I left. People, especially those still suffering under Miles's erratic leadership, were surprisingly eager to vent. They didn't know I was building a case. They just saw an empathetic ear, someone who understood the nuances of the organization. From these conversations, threads would emerge. A new directive Miles had issued, a project that was struggling, a specific complaint about his management style. Each tidbit was a puzzle piece. I started a new, encrypted digital file, meticulously logging everything. Dates, names, verbatim quotes where possible. My memory, already sharp, became even more finely tuned, a vast repository of Miles Thorne's misdeeds. I also kept a close eye on the company's public-facing information. Press releases, quarterly reports, industry news related to Sterling and Finch, all were scrutinized. I'd look for subtle shifts, for corporate speak that masked underlying problems, for projects that seemed to vanish or new ones that appeared out of nowhere. I became adept at reading between the lines, at sensing the currents beneath the placid surface of corporate communications. This was the patient part of my plan, the long game. I wasn't looking for a single smoking gun. I was building a comprehensive narrative, a tapestry woven from years of small, seemingly insignificant threads. My unyielding nature meant I never tired of this silent pursuit. Miles Thorne, meanwhile, was predictably spiraling. After my departure and Aliner's transfer, he went into what my former colleagues jokingly called hermit mode. He'd lock himself in his office, shades drawn, emerging only for mandatory meetings, where he'd present vague, optimistic reports that bore little resemblance to the reality on the ground. He purged the section of any remaining senior personnel, replacing them with newly recruited graduates fresh out of business school. These were young, eager minds, desperate to impress, and crucially lacking the institutional memory or experience to challenge Miles's ill-conceived directives. He wanted to be the sole authority, the fount of all knowledge, the unquestionable leader. He cultivated a culture of fear, ensuring no one dared to contradict him. The predictable consequence was a catastrophic collapse in productivity. The work product, once the pride of Sterling and Finch, became frequently inept. Deadlines were missed, projects stalled, and errors proliferated. My contacts inside my moles, though they never knew they were, would occasionally send me anonymous tips or drop hints during our casual conversations. "You wouldn't believe what's happening with Project Nightingale, Sylvie, it's a mess. Miles just signed off on something that defies all logic." Each whisper was a small triumph for me, confirmation that the ship was indeed sinking, just as Captain Ahab had predicted. The despair would occasionally creep in. Years passed. Miles Thorne was still there, still in charge, still ascending, albeit slowly. There were moments of profound doubt. Had I sacrificed my career for nothing? Would he truly achieve his dream of becoming the youngest executive while I remained a ghost, watching from the sidelines? The bitterness was a physical ache, a tightness in my chest. I saw former colleagues promoted, their careers flourishing, while I was stuck in a purgatory of my own making, an unseen force waiting for an unseen opportunity. There were days when I wanted to give up, to let the fire of vengeance die out, to simply find a new path, however difficult. But then I would remember the injustice, the public humiliation, the sheer arrogance of the man who had stolen my purpose, and my unyielding spirit would reassert itself. This wasn't about anger anymore, it was about principle. It was about ensuring that wrong was righted. The catalyst, the perfect opportunity I had been patiently waiting for, finally presented itself in the 5th year of my forced retirement. It came through an old acquaintance, Peter, who still worked at Sterling and Finch, though in a different branch office. We met for coffee, a casual chat about nothing in particular. But as he talked, a detail slipped out, almost an afterthought. "Miles Thorne," Peter sighed, rolling his eyes. "He's done it again. You know that massive quantum leap project, the one our branch had been working on for 2 years, almost ready for rollout. My ears perked up. Project Quantum Leap was a highly publicized, multi-million-dollar initiative critical for Sterling and Finch's technological future. Yes, I remember it, I said, feigning mild interest. Well, Peter leaned in, his voice dropping. Thorne somehow appropriated it. Stole it, really. Just unilaterally pulled it from us, claimed his section was better equipped to handle the final phase. He shook his head in disbelief. And then he assigned it to some new recruit, fresh out of college, who clearly had no idea what she was doing. The kid, bless her heart, tried, but she destroyed it, absolutely butchered the final code. A cold calm settled over me. This was it. This was the whale. And Miles? I asked, my voice betraying none of the internal tremors. Signed off on everything, Peter scoffed. Didn't even bat an eye, just pushed it through, tried to bury the results, said it was learning experience. The whole thing is a disaster, set us back years, but no one in his section is going to say anything. Too new, too afraid, or too grateful for the easy ride Miles gives them. I simply nodded, taking a slow sip of my coffee. But inside, 1,000 pieces snapped into place. This wasn't just incompetence, this was corporate malfeasance on a grand scale. Stealing a project, destroying it, and then signing off on the destruction, knowing the ramifications. It wasn't just a demotion he deserved, it was professional obliteration. My patient gathering of intel, my unyielding focus, my resourcefulness, it had all led to this moment. The profound despair I had felt watching him succeed while I languished outside the gates, now transformed into a laser-like focus. This was the moment I had waited for. The true revenge, carefully orchestrated and meticulously executed, was about to begin. The audience had felt the outrage and despair of Sylvie's rock bottom. Now the promise of the coming retribution was palpable. The stage was set. The weeks following my coffee with Peter were a blur of intense, focused activity. The quiet desolation of my retirement had evaporated, replaced by a surge of purpose that sharpened my senses and clarified my thoughts. Miles Thorne's appropriation and destruction of Project Quantum Leap wasn't just another misstep. It was the gaping wound in his carefully constructed facade, the vulnerability I had patiently waited for. This was the precise opportunity, the ultimate intersection of his hubris and his incompetence, and it was perfectly aligned with my motivation to ensure not just his demotion, but his total professional obliteration. My years of quiet intel gathering, the vast digital repository of Miles's misdeeds, now became my arsenal. I didn't just have snippets of information. I had a comprehensive timeline, a meticulously documented narrative of his abusive tenure, his ethical lapses, his calculated dismantling of a high-performing section, and now, the crown jewel, the catastrophic failure of Project Quantum Leap under his direct supervision. This wasn't about emotion anymore. It was about precision, strategy, and the unyielding application of justice. My role as the unseen catalyst meant I couldn't simply walk into Sterling and Finch and present my findings. I was an outsider, a former employee who had been subtly forced out. Any direct approach would be dismissed as a disgruntled ex-employee's vendetta. No, my revenge had to be untraceable, a phantom strike that would leave Miles Thorne reeling, but with no one to blame but himself. My resourcefulness was paramount now. I started by reviewing every piece of information I had on Project Quantum Leap. I cross-referenced dates, speculated on communication channels, and even reread old articles about the project's initial launch, searching for any detail that could strengthen my case. My patience, refined over years of waiting, allowed me to scrutinize every detail, no matter how small. I remembered Eleanor Vance's meticulous notes, her careful documentation of Miles's falsified reports. That detail resonated deep within me. It was the template for my own revenge. The first step was to package the information. I decided on a multi-pronged approach, designed to create maximum impact while diffusing any potential link back to me. The Inspector General IG for the organization was the obvious target. The IG's office had the authority, the resources, and crucially, the independence to investigate without fear of internal pressure. But how to deliver the information without leaving a digital or physical footprint? I began by creating a series of anonymous, untraceable email accounts. This wasn't just one. It was a layered network, each account created through a different VPN, using public Wi-Fi networks in libraries and coffee shops across Boston, far from my own home network. I meticulously scrubbed metadata from all documents, converting everything to a non-editable format, like PDFs, before attaching them. Each file was renamed with generic identifiers, stripped of any hint of origin. I even created a new, encrypted folder on a separate, dedicated flash drive that I purchased with cash, ensuring no digital trail led back to my personal devices. The content itself was critical. I organized it into distinct categories. 1. The falsified documents. Scans of the original, ethical documents Aliner had flagged, alongside Miles's manipulated versions. My notes, documenting Aliner's gentle confrontation and Miles's subsequent fury too. The campaign of harassment, a timeline of Aliner's arbitrary performance downgrades, the shifting schedules, the public berating. I included an anonymous account of her attempts to transfer and Miles's refusal. 3. My own retaliation. A summary of how I was targeted after supporting Aliner, the subtle pressures, the fabricated negative reviews, leading to my forced early retirement. This was presented not as a personal grievance, but as a pattern of behavior that demonstrated Miles Thorne's inability to handle dissent or ethical challenges. 4. The collapse of the section. Quotes from former colleagues, anonymized, of course, describing the plummeting morale, the departure of senior personnel, and the resulting ineptitude and missed deadlines under Miles's new, inexperienced Team 5. Project Quantum Leap. This was the linchpin. I gathered all the public information I could find about its original scope and projected success. Then, I painstakingly compiled the anecdotal evidence of Miles's theft of the project, its assignment to an unqualified junior, the specific errors in the final code, details I'd gleaned from Peter's offhand comments, and my own research into industry best practices for such a project. And finally, Miles Thorne's signature on the disastrous completion report. I even included snippets from internal Sterling and Finch newsletters that innocently praised the project's initial progress, highlighting the stark contrast to its eventual collapse. The presentation itself was crucial. It couldn't sound like a rant. It had to be cold, hard facts. I wrote a concise, professional cover letter to the Inspector General, framing it as a matter of significant corporate concern and potential ethical violations. I emphasized the financial implications of Project Quantum Leap's failure, the reputational damage to Sterling and Finch, and the pattern of poor leadership that pointed to a systemic problem within Miles Thorne's section. The letter stated that the sender was an anonymous concerned party who believed in the integrity of the organization and felt compelled to bring these serious issues to light. It did not mention my name, or Aliner's, or anyone specifically. It merely presented the evidence. The delivery was the most nerve-wracking part. I couldn't risk mailing anything from my home or a local post office. I settled on a strategy that combined old-school anonymity with modern digital ghosting. I drafted the email in a public library, connecting to their Wi-Fi, then sent it using one of my burner accounts. The email contained a link to a cloud storage folder, also set up anonymously, where all the meticulously prepared documents were stored. This way, the files weren't directly attached to the email, making it harder to trace the initial sending IP. The link was active for only 24 hours, after which the cloud folder would be deleted. This created a sense of urgency for the IG's office, but a digital trail, however faint, was still a trail. For redundancy and to amplify the signal, I also printed out key documents: the falsified reports, the Project Quantum Leap disaster reports, and a summary of the harassment timeline. I bought a prepaid, disposable cell phone, used it once to send an anonymous text to the IG's publicly listed tip line, stating that critical information had been sent to their general inquiry email address regarding a high-level executive. The phone was then crushed and disposed of in a public waste bin across town. I packaged the printed documents in a plain manila envelope, without a return address, and dropped it into a random public mailbox in a different Boston neighborhood, far from my own. No stamps, no handwritten address, just a printed label. I had taken every conceivable precaution. The waiting was excruciating. Weeks passed. The news feeds were silent. My moles inside Sterling and Finch reported no immediate changes. Miles Thorne, still Captain Ahab, seemed to be sailing on, oblivious. The gnawing doubt that had haunted me during my years of waiting began to creep back in. Had I been too cautious? Had the information been dismissed? Had my years of patience, my unyielding resolve, my meticulous resourcefulness been for nothing? Then, the whispers began. They came through Peter, through another former colleague I occasionally met for coffee, through the subtle shifts in online corporate forums. rumors of an internal audit, whispers of a special investigation. The names of senior executives from Human Resources and the Internal Audit Department were mentioned, people known for their discretion and their unwavering commitment to due process. Miles Thorne, usually so visible in his arrogance, seemed to recede. His office door, once constantly locked, now seemed perpetually shut. He stopped appearing at public events. His name disappeared from internal communications. The story was unfolding exactly as I had meticulously planned. The unseen catalyst was working. The investigation was quietly underway. I allowed myself a small, private smile. This was the rising tension, the long-awaited progression of the grand payoff. The quiet satisfaction was immense. If you're captivated by the intricate unraveling of a meticulously planned revenge, where every detail matters, remember to subscribe to Tales of Revenge channel for new revenge stories daily. My story was rapidly approaching its climax. The final collapse was swift and decisive. It began with the complete disappearance of Miles Thorne from public view within Sterling and Finch. His office, once a symbol of his arrogance, now stood as a sealed tomb, its shades drawn, its door locked from the inside. There were no more boasts, no more public berations, no more arbitrary directives. He simply vanished from the daily operations. The whispers, once faint, grew into a deafening roar within the corporate hallways. An internal investigation, led by the Inspector General's office, was confirmed. The focus was Miles Thorne, his section, and most tellingly, Project Quantum Leap. My sources inside, unwitting network of contacts who thought they were just catching up with an old colleague, began to relay details. The IG's team was thorough, relentless. They were pulling records, interviewing everyone, cross-referencing performance metrics, and most damningly, scrutinizing the documentation surrounding Project Quantum Leap. They had found the trail I had so carefully laid out, the inconsistencies, the manipulated figures, the evidence of his deliberate destruction of the project. The falsified documents Aliner had bravely called out years ago, the systematic abuse of power, the sheer ineptitude masked by hubris, it was all being exposed. The reckoning came in the form of an internal memo, terse and devoid of specifics, but its implications were devastating. Miles Thorne had been relieved of his managerial duties and reassigned to a non-managerial role in a remote office location. This was corporate speak for a total professional obliteration, precisely what I had aimed for. He was removed from the executive fast-track program he had so proudly proclaimed would make him the youngest executive in the company's history. His ambition, once his guiding star, had become the very instrument of his downfall. He would never climb the ladder again. He would be relegated to a forgotten corner of the company, a purgatorial existence where his arrogance would fester, unacknowledged and powerless. I learned the precise details from Peter, my coffee contact, who seemed to take immense satisfaction in recounting the downfall. Miles, stripped of his authority, was sent to a small, isolated branch office in rural Vermont, miles from any major corporate center. His new role was a dead end, a meaningless title designed to keep him employed but completely neutralized. He was, as Peter put it, kneecapped. There was no fanfare, no public shaming beyond the internal whispers. Just a quiet, surgical removal. The grand payoff for me wasn't a triumphant dance or a loud proclamation. It was a profound, quiet satisfaction that settled deep within my bones, replacing the years of gnawing injustice. I had not sought fame or recognition. I had sought justice, a precise, calculated retribution for the life he had so carelessly disrupted. My unyielding patience had paid off. My resourcefulness had crafted the perfect trap. My role as the unseen catalyst had been fulfilled. Miles Thorne would live out his professional life in a corporate Siberia, forever haunted by the shadow of what he thought he deserved, and by the ghost of the career he had so deliberately destroyed. In the aftermath, the section Miles Thorne had decimated slowly began to heal. Senior personnel, some of whom had been forced out or had left in despair, were quietly brought back or replaced by competent leaders. Productivity began to recover. The morale, once shattered, slowly pieced itself back together. It was a quiet triumph, a silent testament to the idea that integrity, even when suppressed, will eventually find its voice. I, Sylvie Kincaid, found my own form of peace. The bitterness that had clung to me for years began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of vindication. I hadn't just survived, I had prevailed. My identity, once fractured by the loss of my career, began to redefine itself. I wasn't just a former professional, I was a woman who had stood for what was right, who had refused to let injustice stand, and who had patiently, meticulously orchestrated a precise and effective retribution. The desire for vindication, my core motivation, had been fully realized. I felt lighter, unburdened by the weight of the past. My life shifted again, but this time it was a shift toward true freedom. I volunteered at a local community center, applying my meticulous organizational skills to real-world problems. I enrolled in adult education classes, purely for the joy of learning, not for professional advancement. I traveled, something I had always put off for later, now embracing the later with open arms. The world, once viewed through the narrow lens of my simmering anger, now expanded into a kaleidoscope of possibilities. There was one final, surprising twist that solidified the depth of Miles Thorne's undoing. Several months after his demotion, I received an anonymous email, forwarded to me by a former colleague who had managed to retain some of my contact information. It was an internal memo from the IG's office, subtly disguised as a lessons learned document outlining the various mismanagement practices that had led to the Project Quantum Leap failure and other systemic issues. What caught my eye was a small, almost throwaway line in the memo's summary, a sentence detailing a key piece of evidence, an obscure, seemingly insignificant piece of code within the original Project Quantum Leap framework that, when cross-referenced with a specific, dated log entry, irrefutably proved the project had been tampered with under Miles Thorne's direct supervision. This detail was something I hadn't explicitly included in my original dossier, assuming it was too technical or obscure to matter. But it was a detail Eleanor Vance had highlighted in her meticulous notes, back when she was fighting Miles's initial falsifications. A small, seemingly unrelated fact she'd recorded, a detail about how a particular system protocol had been circumvented years ago. My plan had worked. Not just because of my comprehensive evidence, but because of a tiny, almost overlooked detail that linked the current disaster directly back to Miles Thorne's earliest, most fundamental ethical lapse. It was Eleanor's ghost, a quiet echo of her integrity that had truly sealed his fate. He had tried to break her, but in her meticulousness, she had inadvertently provided the final, undeniable piece of the puzzle that would eventually obliterate him. The irony was almost poetic. As the sun set over Boston, casting long shadows across the skyline, I often found myself reflecting on the journey. It had been long, arduous, and at times deeply painful. But I had faced the darkness, navigated the despair, and ultimately found my way to the light. The taste of victory was not sweet, but rather a quiet, profound peace. I had reclaimed my dignity, not through conflict, but through an unwavering pursuit of justice. And for me, that was enough. The stories of retribution are many, unfolding daily in quiet corners and grand stages. And if you seek more tales where wrongs are righted and justice is patiently, meticulously served, remember this. Subscribe to Tales of Revenge channel for new revenge stories daily.